good evening, and welcome to the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, and to our lecture series. I am Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society. This program is supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, in partnership with the City Council. I also want to express our thanks to our co-partner for this event, the New York Landmarks Conservancy. For those of you who this may be your first visit, the General Society was founded in 1785. We are 233 years old. Oh, well, thank you. And this is our fifth home. Today, our organization continues to serve the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our Lott Museum, which is upstairs, and you're more than welcome to visit the Lott Museum after the program tonight. The library, of course, of which you're in. And we have a tuition-free school called the Mechanics Institute. And finally, our lecture series program, which is nearly 200 years old. And of course, tonight's lecture is part of that program. Tonight, we are celebrating the work of Adam Van Doren. The Stones of Yale is Adam's latest book. Others include An Artist in Venice and An Artist in Rome. Adam is extremely multi-talented. He's also written and directed two PBS documentaries about the arts, one on James Thurber and the other about Harold Ross and the New Yorker. His artwork is included in museums, galleries, and libraries across the country, and he teaches art at Yale, where he is an associate fellow. And I believe one of his paintings, in addition to the many places it hangs, also hangs. One hangs in particular at the New York Landmarks Conservancy offices. Adam earned his bachelor and master degrees in architecture at Columbia. He studied under Robert A.M. Stern, who also wrote the introduction to his book. There will be an opportunity to purchase a copy of Stones of Yale this evening and have Adam write a personal dedication to you after tonight's talk. To talk about his book, it is now my great pleasure to introduce to you Adam Van Doren.
Good evening. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Very much appreciate it. It's a great honor to be here in this incredible space. I actually was here this afternoon for lunch. There's a club that's called the Coffee House Club that's in the same building upstairs. Not quite 200 and whatever years old. It's 110 years, but that's still old. I'd also like to plug one member of that club, Helen Fish. Where is she? She's on the Board of Governors here, which I didn't know until tonight, although I know her through that club. So here we are. I'm going to give a talk about Yale's architecture. I want to just give you a little background before I go into the paintings that illustrate the book, which she mentioned is available in the back. If you want to purchase a copy, I'd be glad to sign it. The book includes not only my illustrations, but my essays about each of the buildings that I chose to paint. A little background about the book. It started really a number of years ago when a famous historian who was also a Yale alum, David McCullough, I'm sure some of you have read his works, he and I collaborated more recently on a book called The House Tells the Story, Homes of the American Presidents, where I went around the country and painted these houses in situ, and David and I collaborated on that. I wrote that as well, but he did the introduction. But a few years ago, he said, Adam, what are you going to do for your next book? And I said, I don't know, David. Do you have a good idea? And he said, well, have you ever done Yale? And I said, no, I haven't really painted the campus. He said, well, if you don't, I will. He's actually a very good painter. Not many people know that, but he's a wonderful artist as well as a writer. So one thing led to another. I pursued the project as kind of a possible idea, but put it in the back of my mind. A few years ago, just before the book was started, my publisher, David Godine, who maybe some of you know his work, he's been publishing for about 50 years now, still alive. People think he's 150, but he's only 70-something. He started while he was in college. But he said, Adam, why don't you do a book about Yale? And I said, okay. But who's going to buy that except Yale people? He said, Adam, that's enough people. So I said, all right, well, I'll do it as long as I could write a book that isn't just for people who, Yale people or have gone there. And so I wanted to write it as a book that anyone might pick up. Now, presumably, most people have already an interest or a connection, but I did try to keep an open mind to the reader so that people who have presumably some interest in Yale, but maybe collegiate architecture or architecture in general, might be drawn to it. And that was kind of the structure of the book, to leave that as a kind of an open window onto the campus. I originally was thinking about the best way to do it, but long story short, I picked 30 buildings that interested me, that I wanted to paint. I tried to keep a variety. You could just paint Gothic buildings, and that would be kind of boring. So I tried to mix it up and do some of the more contemporary buildings that came after the 60s. The bottom line is that, how did I open it up to the general public? Well, Yale's history is very much America's history. Yale was founded in 1701, so if you jump a couple of years back, it's 1699. That's a long time. That's 75 years before the Declaration of Independence. And there's so many currents of our American story that are paralleled with Yale's story. So I tried to interject that in the book as well. So without going too much more into this, I'll just say that the format of the essays were not architectural analysis of each building, which I think can be somewhat dull, especially since it's been done already. I'm sure many books on Yale exist. I chose to talk about the stories behind the buildings. I sought out my colleagues at Yale who are professors, and I spoke to my students. I spoke to old Yale alums, newer Yale alums, and tried to gather memories, recollections, and as I say, memories about the buildings, because architecture ultimately is that for most people. They're not looking and saying, well, that's a architrave or a pediment or an entablature. People at landmarks know that, but most people don't respond. But they have strong memories, don't they? And I tried to get people to articulate those. One of them was Sam Waterson, the actor, who I know just very briefly, but I wrote to him, and he wrote back a long description of his memories that were wonderful, and I added some of those in the book. All right, so why don't we go to the PowerPoint, if you will, the images. I'll talk about them, and there'll be some questions at the end if you'd like. But let's start. This is a cover of the book, and it shows Yale's most famous building, Harkness Hall, which can be seen anywhere on the campus, for those of you who have been to the campus. How many of you would say you've visited Yale's campus? Or maybe, oh, wow, okay. So I'm preaching to the choir. That can be good, and a little bit easier for me. All right. This is just some early correspondence I had with David McCullough. I teach in Davenport College, although the class is open to anyone at Yale and the college. My classroom is there, and that's the entrance to Davenport. And I wrote to David in my early days of teaching, and I did an illustrated letter, which he got a kick out of. This is another image from Yale that I sent to him, and he's even got my stationery, which today is still relevant. I still am at 130 West 57th Street, where I have my studio. This was just a tongue-in-cheek thing. David enjoys my caricatures. I did some images of some famous Yale alums. Dean Keller, who maybe some of you know, was one of the Monuments Men that was played by George Clooney. And he was also a Yale art teacher. John Trumbull, who was not actually a Yale man, I think he went to Harvard, but he gave his collection of paintings to Yale, which later became the Yale Art Gallery, one of the greatest museums really now in the United States. They just did a huge expansion. Cole Porter, some of you I'm sure have heard of, a Yale grad. Archibald MacLeish, who was actually a good friend of my grandfather's years ago. George H.W. Bush, who was the captain of the baseball team. Vince Scully, who just passed away. The book is dedicated to him. He gave some of the great lectures on Yale architecture history and art history for, 50 years. He's what they call a Yale lifer. He was, or New Haven lifer, one or the other. He was born in New Haven and got 6 degrees at Yale, I think. I also show Maya Lin. There's not many women in the Yale history until the 70s because, of course, they didn't admit women until then. Maya Lin, I guess most of you know, did some famous monuments, memorials in Washington, and she did a memorial at Yale celebrating the women who were admitted. There's David McCullough at his most recent home in Hingham, Mass. Of course, there's an American flag behind him, so I had to capture that. There I am, painting on campus. So if you have any doubts that I paint outdoors, there I am. I got my preppy clothing, my topsiders, and I don't know who took the picture, but I have a record. This is a map that comes with the book, specially designed to show the various locations of the buildings I chose. There's probably 100 more buildings that I didn't select, just because either I didn't find them interesting or, as I say, they might be redundant looking. But this is in the back of the book. Now this is a picture I usually show for people who have no knowledge of Yale, but this is its most famous graduate, Nathan Hale, who apparently was executed in about 6 different places in Manhattan. They all like to claim that. The Yale Club, of course, claims that it's on their corner, but nobody knows exactly where it happened. This is an early image of the Yale before the huge Yale that we know today in the 1700s, when it was just a few buildings. Before it was called Yale, it was called the Collegiate School. I'll tell you one quick story. The school is named after a man who gave the equivalent of about 100 books to Yale, Elihu Yale, and that was enough to name the school after him. This is now the beginning of my images of my paintings. This is, again, Harkness Hall. I did this from the roof of the Yale Art Gallery as a commission from the Art Gallery itself to commemorate a room for the outgoing president, President Levin. You can see again how that Harkness Tower still looms over everything. This is Wrexham Tower, a sort of an imitation of another building in England, overlooking where Elihu Yale is buried. So very inside joke, if you will. This stands over Saybrook College, one of the most beautiful colleges at Yale. As I'm sure many of you know, Yale's divided up into 10, now 12 residential colleges, which are really just for living and eating and congregating. There aren't really many classrooms in there. But this is that quintessential neo-Gothic that Yale is known for. Let me see. Are we getting another? Oh, well, that's not working. Oops. Already a technical glitch? Oh, there we go. This is another view of Harkness with a little more moody landscape taken from Pearson College. What's interesting to note is that this is Branford College, another college which is right next to Pearson. It's so interesting that the Yale that you see today is largely the Yale of 1920, not 1701. People who are not necessarily looking at architecture from a perspective of knowledge with dates and years come to Yale and think these buildings have been there since the Middle Ages. But Yale was a relatively small place before, let me just try to get this. I don't know why this thing is, okay. That's this main library, Sterling. What was happening, though, and why Yale changed and expanded so exponentially is it had a very solid community of students and faculty from, I'm just throwing out, from the 1830s to 1900. It was a small band of people that were very connected, but the population was increasing, more people were going to college. The Yale that of old was now growing beyond its space, and students were beginning to realize, or the faculty, or the administration rather, was beginning to realize the students no longer had the bonds that they used to have. They didn't really know each other. There weren't dormitories back then. You lived in boarding houses, you lived in fraternities, secret societies. The community during those 19th century era, believe it or not, there was no common hall. They hung around what was known as the Yale fence, which was on, if people know New Haven, College and Chapel Streets, on the corner there was the principal spot. They hung around there, and that was their gathering place. And there was a whole hierarchy about who sat on the fence. Juniors could sit on one side, seniors on another, sophomores on another side, freshmen, forget it. And they sat, many of them aristocratic with their top hats and whatnot. And many times they just gathered there to sing. I don't think any college is more famous for singing than Yale. The Whiffenpoofs are a famous singing group, and one of their songs is an old hit that even Elvis Presley recorded. But Yale realized that they're going to have to change. This is another view of Sterling Library, again, built in the 20s. This is the older campus, still called Old Campus. Yale realized they were going to need to change, and what they did was take on probably the most ambitious building project in the history of collegiate architecture by far. They decided to go to Oxford and Cambridge, where these so-called colleges, residential colleges, existed, and use that as a model for the new Yale. They knew that these colleges in England had created a bond with student and faculty that was so intense they wanted to mimic that. And a man named Harkness, who made his fortune in, he was one of the silent partners in Rockefeller Standard Oil, eventually gave the money to build these colleges. And what did Yale do? They wanted not only to have that feeling of a residential college, they wanted to look like Oxford and Yale and Cambridge. So you can imagine the cost involved. They had to actually, this is that Yale fence, by the way. I did a picture of Yale baseball players at that time hanging out. This is another building I'll talk about in a minute. But they basically undertook to there was no stonemasons of any great distinction in America. This was a country where wood was what most of the buildings were made out of, wasn't it? It was full of trees. But the stonemasons were in Europe, in Italy in particular. And so Harkness and his Yale team, they brought over hundreds of laborers who were very good stone cutters. To this day, many residents of New Haven, you know it's probably famous for its pizza places, a lot of Italians originated from that group that came over to build Yale. And it's billions and billions and billions of dollars in today's money. There's no other way to imagine how you could have afforded this. So that's a testament to Yale, and now, of course, it created an alumni base. It's one of the greatest in the country, so they certainly created community. This is a building that's not so Gothic, and actually is not actually affiliated with Yale formally, but it's a part of the Yale fabric. This is one of the secret society buildings. There are 41 secret societies. Only a few have actually headquarters. This one I chose, it's called Scroll and Key. I mentioned this in the book. Skull and Bones, I'm sure some of you have heard, is the more famous one, but the building isn't very compelling to paint. It's kind of a dull, reddish Victorian stone. So I thought this was more interesting to do a watercolor of, and that's what I chose to do. I couldn't go inside it, of course, because they don't allow you even if you're a faculty member. But it's a wonderful Moorish building that almost looks like the kind of thing Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty would have met in to have their last chapter in a Conan Doyle mystery. This is Davenport College, which is this neo-Georgian style that the architect James Gamble Rogers did. He did so much of the architecture of Yale in that 20s building program that he stands out, without a doubt, as the greatest contributor to the campus that we know today. You all are architecturally minded for the most part here, I'm sure. James Gamble Rogers is perhaps a forgotten figure, but I think he's one of America's greatest architects. And for those to dismiss him as, oh wow, anyone can just copy a neo-Gothic or colonial building, how hard is that? Well, that actually misses the point. Rogers made enormously interesting spaces. His colonnades, his sense of scale, his choice of materials, the movement that you have between rooms is extraordinary, and it really creates the bond that the students and faculty have based on the architecture. So I would say you put 100 very distinguished architects in a room and tell them design a Gothic, neo-Gothic building, I don't think only one or two would do them in the extraordinary way that Rogers did. Because in the end, it's about proportions. You could have someone do a classical building. They make these columns 10 times too big, 10 times too small. So it's a lot of architecture beyond the style that makes a great building. Let's go on. Oh, trying to change the slide. What's that? What is this? That's that one.
Yeah, it's just taking its sweet time.
Do you think the next one's going to work? This is Jonathan Edwards College, named after a famous preacher who was in the early days of Yale. So I'll just keep pressing that, right? This is Yale is students are no stranger to great facilities. This is one of the dining halls at Jonathan Edwards that I painted. That's a repeat. This is the Sterling Law School. Sterling was another one of the great benefactors of Yale, and I tried to figure out how did he get so much money. He was just a lawyer, and I thought, well, lawyers make money, but what's the most you could make, $600, $700 an hour? I mean, you would have to have a vast fortune to have contributed as much as he did to Yale. Well, the reason is he was one of the first corporate lawyers in America and worked with the railroad companies, so he may have gotten stock. But he's responsible for the Sterling Library, Sterling Law School, and many other buildings. Boy, this is really not, all right, I have to keep pressing, I guess. This is another view of the Sterling Neo-Gothic Law School with these wonderful towers. This is a side view of one of the buildings at Sterling. Now, for those of you who are interested in painting, this is on a very toothy paper. Some of the papers I use are smoother, or what we call cold press. They have a little bit of tooth. But this is very rough, and it creates, I think, a very interesting effect. I like to mix up papers so that I can do a variety of styles. This is Buckley College, right next to the Sterling Library. That is also one of Rogers' work. This is the largest residential college, Silliman, which was actually not done by Rogers. This was done by a group called Eggers, if you know that name. But this building looks like the Colonial Williamsburg Town Hall on the right. This is a building I did actually of Timothy Dwight College, but it's done on a tinted bluish paper that is one of the techniques that I use and what I share with my students. It's kind of a forgotten art, but you work in effect backwards, where you apply the white instead of leaving the white of the paper. You can see in the top I use gouache. It's not a great lighting for this, but maybe there'll be more. Like this one you can see is where the paper is actually already done for you. I mean, the color of the paper is already there, and I've added the whites instead of saving them. This is Woolsley Hall, also done in that 20s period. It's really to celebrate the veterans of World War I. I think the entire class of Yale for 4 years went to war. The list is huge, and they're all written in script in stone in one of the buildings. This is the other side of Woolsley Hall that I painted coming out onto what is the College Silliman. It's kind of hard to gauge this just from these images, but those of you from Yale would know, but the map would help if you looked in the book. This is a college done, was known as Calhoun College, but after a controversy that's mentioned in the book, and maybe some of you read about, it was changed to Grace Hopper. But it has a wonderful mixture of stone and brick, kind of like Richard Norman Shaw's English Victorian architecture, at least that's what I think of it. Another view of Calhoun College. This is another different style that I included in the book, more of a Venetian Gothic, and this is known as Stokel Hall. It was once a fraternity, believe it or not, but a wonderful melange of this kind of birthday cake decoration that you almost expect a gondola to float by. This looks like something out of Psycho or the Addams Family. This was the home of one of the wealthiest New Haven residents at the Victorian age. It's 50 rooms, 20 fireplaces, whatever. Yale bought the building about a number of years ago and turned it into some sort of global policy headquarters or something. So it's more sterile now. Now we kind of moving into the more modern era, if you will. This is the Yale Architecture School. And when this was built in 61 or 2, it was a great shock to those who thought of Yale as a traditional-looking campus. And to Yale's credit, they started this building campaign from then until now of incorporating some of the best modern architects. Before that, I should add that a lot of people were very upset that Yale in the 20s, when they embarked on this building program, wasn't doing modern buildings of the international style. That was the style of the 20s and 30s, was it not? And they didn't quite appreciate why they went into this more retro mode. Vincent Scully, who we mentioned, has an interesting take on that. He said, you know, I was one of those people that was very upset in those days. He lived to be 100, so he remembers those early days, thinking, what is Yale doing? Such a conservative choice, and it's supposed to be a progressive, you know, great institution of higher learning. But he said, in the 50 years I've been teaching, I've benefited from all these wonderful spaces, all this great shade and shadow under the trees, and these colonnades, and these wonderful niches, and these elements of the traditional architecture. He said, looking back, I felt that I was, like so many people at that time, very childish and foolish, because we gained so much from that. And there's something to be said for that earlier choice. But at some point, they had to move on. And this is Paul Rudolph's building of the Yale Architecture School, which is known as a brutalist building. I spoke to Sam Chauncey, who wrote the preface, along with Robert Stern, who wrote the foreword. He's been there for years. He was on the building committee at the time with the president, Whitney Griswold. And Griswold had hired Paul Rudolph to design the architecture school, where he was the dean. And they got the design, and they saw the model, and Griswold sort of like said to Sam Chauncey, this advisor he had off in a corner, he said, oh my God, what have we done? This is a disaster. Nobody's going to like this. I don't like this. It was such a departure from anything they had seen. Wasn't delicate or lacy, of course, was it? Very heavy-handed, brutalist, right? Which actually I think comes from the word raw in French when they describe this style. But as Chauncey recalls, Griswold was in a bit of a bind, because if he didn't show confidence in his dean of architecture school, what are his students going to think? So they elected to hold their nose and let the building be built. And Chauncey remembers, as the building was going up, he saw a team of 50 workmen banging with hammers into the concrete. And he thought, what in the heck are they doing? Well, they were creating this rough aggregate texture to the concrete that Chauncey remembers, as the president did. We didn't see that on the model. That's where all the money is going. But now it's considered a landmark and on the National Register, I think. This is a more modern building, done only about 10 years ago. Oops, we're jumping around, of the boathouse. This is a wonderful new building for the Forestry School. For those who have not been to the Yale campus in a while, this was done, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago, maybe less. An extraordinary building, all sustainable, eco-friendly kind of design, all in wood for the most part. And it has this incredible atrium in the front, in the main hall when you come in. This is, stepping back a few years before that, is Saarinen's work on the Yale skating rink, known as the Whale, because it sort of looks like one if you see the full profile. This is, again, was Yale embracing some of the great architects of the time. And then this is the Yale Bowl. Now, this is an engineering marvel of 1910 or so. But what's also interesting, when I spoke to people about this building, one of the things that they said, which was, I thought, very interesting, is most stadiums have an opening on one side where you can see out. Often it's with a big scoreboard or something, so that you know there's an outside world beyond the game itself. Well, the Yale Bowl is completely in the round. It's more of an oval, but it's it's completely in the round, so you have no idea of the outside world. So you really, when it's a full crowd, you really feel like you're in another kind of time or suspension of time and just looking at the game, which is an interesting insight. This is the Beinecke Library, which I mentioned in the book, is actually one of my favorite structures there. If you haven't been inside this building, it's an extraordinary experience. Gordon Bunshaft was the designer. I tried to show this in my watercolor, these little squares that appear on the outside, kind of like 50s TV sets. But it's made of the outside is made of very thin panels of marble that allow light to filter in without affecting too much natural light to affect the archives, which has some of the great rare books and artifacts in America. This is the Center for British Art, which Paul Mellon gave most of his work to Yale in order that they make a museum. This was done by Louis Kahn, of course, a very famous architect who did more recently, posthumously, the memorial to FDR off of Roosevelt Island, right? Isn't that, yeah. This is also a building by Louis Kahn, the Yale Art Gallery, which has recently gone under a great expansion. Louis Kahn was a fixture on campus in those days. He was a professor in the architecture school, but was always kind of very disheveled. They said he looked like an unmade bed, but he was determined. He had not built very many buildings in the 60s. He was determined to build a building at Yale. He met our friend Whitney Griswold, the president, at J Press in New Haven, and he kind of stalked him, so the story goes, by Sam Chauncey, and he saw Griswold looking at some ties, and he said, "Nice ties." And Griswold looked at this man, "Who is this?" Even though he was a professor in his faculty. But he said to Griswold, "I'm Louis Kahn, and I want to design your art gallery." Well, lo and behold, that happened. And we're coming now to the close of these, I'll step back. To the close of these images. This is more closer to home. In fact, it's probably 300 feet from here. The Yale Club of New York, also done by James Gamble Rogers. I should add there is a James Gamble Rogers III, his grandson, which I met to talk about his grandfather's work. This building is insane because it's so big, right? For a club, it's, 25 stories high. One of the stories behind it was the Grand Central allowed Yale to build this building on their grounds as long as they made it into a hotel. In case the Yale Club failed, they want to be able to convert it to a hotel. Well, Yale Club is still here almost 100 years later. This is a painting I did of Morey's, which is the famous watering hole at Yale, where people, students particularly, come to sing in the a cappella groups. Sort of a fixture on the campus. Food's not very good. I wish I could say it was better. It's improving. It's had its up and down days, but it's a wonderful place to hang out. And I did a talk there, and it's really sort of the center of, in many ways, the cultural life, certainly of a certain time, and now it's creeping back into becoming another fixture again on the campus. This is the Elizabethan Club, which houses some of the best collection of Renaissance literature in the United States. In this little building, there is a vault that was inserted to house this incredible collection, which in some cases, I don't know what price you can put on some of these books because they have Shakespeare folios, which no doubt are incredibly valuable, but they also have what are called Shakespeare quartos, which are books that were published separately before they were bound into a folio. So they have the original Hamlet published as a separate book. I mean, you can imagine what that's worth. And I don't know how many, I think there's 5 in existence. And the Elizabethan Club has 2 or 3. But the man who made the fortune to give this collection to Yale and to put it in this house that he bought on campus made his fortune in carpet in Yonkers, I believe. Coming down to the last few images, this is, I'm sure many of you know this figure. If you don't know him as a sculpture, as a piece of sculpture, this is Robert A.M. Stern, who made himself into a gargoyle for one of the new colleges that was built only the last couple of years, which is also in this traditional style. Of course, that's Stern's forte, but he made himself the author college through this gargoyle. And I think this is the last of two. This is just sort of a tongue-in-cheek. On the top second row on the far right is the word Chauncey. That is the name of the first graduate of Yale, and the man I've been referring to as Sam Chauncey, who wrote the preface, is direct descendant of that first graduate. And last but not least, this is just a picture of my students at work. I get them to paint in many ways the way I paint, which is outdoors. I'll be going there tomorrow if anyone wants to come, and we'll be painting outdoors. The weather is nice. But I teach them, and here on the left, on that tinted paper, we do some exercises with that. We, of course, also work with white paper, and they're painting in what is that area known as the Bicentennial Buildings. So with that, I'd like to close with reading one excerpt from the book to give you a flavor of the inside, outside of the paintings. And this is, I'm editing, I'm not going to read the whole chapter. The chapters are not that long, but I think for the sake of time, this is a chapter I did on that building, Harkness Tower, which was Roger's masterpiece, and which we looked at several times. Campus landmark, Harkness Tower. I've always wanted to climb to the top of Harkness Tower. It is 284 steps to the summit, though, and it seems that whenever I got the urge to tackle it, to borrow a phrase from Mark Twain, I opted instead to lie down till the urge went away. Then one day a marvelous thing happened. My student Isabel Zeng knew of my interest in the Gothic Tower, and she suggested I contact a fellow student, Andy Zhang, for a tour. Would you like to see the Carillon as well? Andy asked over the phone. What is that? I said, feigning ignorance. Well, it's what rings the bells. I was sold at once. The tower's pealing bells are one of the hallmarks of the Yale campus and one of its most beguiling features. I wasted no time setting up an appointment for the following day when Annie was on call to perform on the instrument from 12:30 to 1 p.m. Meet me at 12:15 at High Street, near the Branford College entrance, he instructed. I arrived on time and waited in anticipation in front of the thick black wrought iron gates. I heard approaching footsteps along a stone path, and there was my host, ready to greet me. Welcome. Come in, Andy said as he opened the gate. Follow me. We walked under a stone archway, came to a thick wooden door, and entered the tower. As we climbed, curling upward on the spiral staircase, Andy informed me that he was one of only 12 Caroliners at Yale and that the competition to become one is fierce. More than 100 people audition each year, and they must practice for 3 months or more before they can even be considered. A carillon resembles an organ, but the keyboard is made of wooden pegs that must be pushed down with substantial force, nothing like the soft touch one would use playing the piano. So it takes quite a bit of practice to learn. How long have you been playing it? I asked. Andy seemed very young to me. 4.5 years. I played it at Yale College, and now I'm in graduate school here studying linguistics. When we arrived at the upper floor, just below the top, I marveled at the instrument before us. It was connected to a series of taut silver metal wires that rose in a row to the ceiling. They were attached to the bell clappers from there. Originally, there were only 10 bells, Andy said, but that only produces a chime. Fortunately, the chimes were converted to a carillon in 1966 by the addition of 44 bells, the gift of an anonymous donor. They came from England, where the original 10 bells were made. So now we have 4 octaves. Andy then sat down to play. He bowed his head in silence for a moment, as if he were channeling 100 years of history, and then his hands sprang into action. The first piece was the Jean de Mulder Suite by Joseph Hollander. Andy was all business. His eyes were riveted to the row of pegs worn with age as he pounded them with his fist with surprising precision and speed. What dexterity! It was like watching Horowitz play a Rhapsody by Liszt. His concentration was total, and I dared not interrupt him. Below his feet, in sneakers, were equally nimble, shuffling rapidly on a set of pedals as though he were executing an elaborate two-step dance number. The bells above responded in unison, and the music sounded like a harp on steroids. For his final number, Andy played the Sakura Fantasy by Kazuburo Hirai from 1953. The piece ended with a riveting climax, and the carillon went suddenly silent. "Would you like to chime the hour?" Andy asked. "Absolutely," I said, not giving him a moment to reconsider. With patience and gentle prodding, he showed me which pegs to push, pointing to this one, then that one, so that the stentorian tones of the Westminster chimes rang out. Ding dong, ding dang, ding dang, ding dong. I'd done it. Now my life was complete. I was ready for my close-up, perhaps a round of Bach. I thanked Andy for being such an indulgent guide and wound my way back down the spiral staircase. Back in New York the next day, I couldn't wait to share the details of my 15 minutes, or rather 15 seconds, of fame as a bell ringer with my friends at a luncheon club that I frequent in Manhattan, right upstairs, the coffee house. One of them, the New Yorker writer Roger Angell, couldn't resist. "Now I'll have to call you Quasimodo." Jokes aside, my moment in Harkness is one that I will always remember. Now when I walk across campus and hear the bells, the bright rush of sound does not seem as far away as it used to. I can now hear it in my fingers. Thank you very much. Thank you. We have a moment, if you would like to ask any questions, Yale trivia or otherwise.
Before we begin the Q&A, please take note that we are videotaping, so please wait for the microphone to come to you.
All right, there we go, protocol. Just pretend you're in one of my classes, I'll treat you well. Okay, we have a question over here.
Yes, your style reminds me of the Scott Forsman Dick and Jane books of the late 40s and early 50s, and the golden books of Simon Schuster, where you'd see artist conception. Do they play any role in your style?
Right. Would you like to talk about what my style?
In terms of your style, in terms of how you conceive of these buildings when you approach the illustration. Right.
Well, let's see. One of the hallmarks, if you will, of my style is there's some elements where they're left a bit unfinished, perhaps. I consider them finished. But I find like I enjoy capturing the moment that I have doing those paintings, and that's usually 2 or 3 hours, maybe 4 at the most. And eventually, the sun gets hot, your butt starts to hurt, and I stop. But I feel like I've captured the essence, hopefully, of what I've done. If I haven't filled in all of the details, I like to think that the viewer gets a chance to fill that in themselves. And I think photorealism is kind of an incredible feat, but after I've seen it once, I don't really want to see it again. I feel like all the work's been done for me. So there's an element that I certainly didn't invent, but it's one that I'm drawn to. And I don't find I come back the next day and finish it. I feel like that was my moment. That's where the sky was, the sun, the light. And so I do another one. But that's one aspect of my style. I also I studied architecture, so I tend to like to draw details. But I try to keep not feel like I got to draw every single mullion and every single window. I try to give a suggestion of some of the architecture without doing every aspect of it. I guess if you were doing the figure and you knew anatomy very well, you wouldn't have to draw every single muscle bump. You would know the critical ones that show you which one where the elbow is or where the knuckle is. So you begin to be aware of what to leave in and leave out. Yes?
In the early 1970s, I lived for a year or two about a half a block from the School of Architecture, and I vividly remember the night of the fire.
Oh, yes.
And how much did they Did they indeed change that building when they rebuilt after the fire?
Yes, there's a lot of stories about this famous fire in the 60s. I spoke about the faculty and administration, or maybe more about the administration I spoke about, that didn't like the building initially. The students apparently didn't either. Beyond the style, they found it a very awkward place to work. There's 29 different levels, so you're moving all over the place. They found the space is cramped. There's a lot of issues I won't go into. But there is a legend, a myth, a possibility that the students actually started the fire that almost destroyed the building. And it did so much to the inside that the architecture school was thinking of just dropping not only the building and starting over, but forgetting about the architecture school. This was the 60s, tempestuous period to begin with. I had one associate who was the curator at the Yale Art Gallery for many years. She said, I was there, I was a PhD student working in the basement, and when I went back the day after the fire, my typewriter had melted. And she said, I threw it out, but I wish I'd saved that as a memento of those times. They obviously, redid it. It looks fine now, but I don't know all the details of how but I think it was touch and go as to whether they could save it. The real story apparently is that the students put up partitions so they could have a sense of privacy, because it was all an open set of desks, and they didn't like that, and they think the cardboard partitions that were makeshift started the fire when somebody dropped a cigarette or something. You had a question?
I studied graphic design at Yale, and we had some classes in the A&A building, and Alvin Eisenman, the chair of the department, loved to tell the story of either the night of the fire, I think maybe while the fire was going on, some people went down to the basement, and there were students there, and they had T-shirts that said CIA on them. Oh. And it made everybody quite suspicious. What the hell is going on in this building? It was students from the Culinary Institute of America, which used to be New Haven, who were doing some printing in the building.
That's funny.
But actually, I had a question. That was just a comment. And maybe, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but I had never really thought about it. One of the most beguiling things about the ensemble of colleges is the fact that some are neo-Gothic and some are neo-Georgian. Do you know anything about the choice, about who got Gothic and who got Georgian?
It's a good question. I don't know exactly, but it brings to mind an important point I'm glad you brought up about the style that Rogers was going back and forth between. He was equally facile in both. He was obsessed about making the buildings that he built look like they had always been there. So he had the slate tiles in the Gothic buildings left in the Long Island Sound for 3 months, so they'd build up algae and flotsam and jetsams or whatever, so they would come on the building looking already like they'd been there for 300 years. He even specified broken glass in some of the buildings. They say it looked like a Y for Yale in the broken glass, but he wanted that to also feel like it had always been there. The bluestone was chipped in certain areas. There was patch marks in the stone. This was his belief. He also, which is the different thing about Robert Stern's new residential colleges, they look brand new because that's what they are. He didn't try to make them look old per se. He was waiting for the patina to develop, which will be 50 years from now. Rogers wanted it right away, so they would fit in. I'm sure Yale alums who came back 50 years later after their graduation in the 1920s, and they came back in the 1925 or whatever it was, and they were like, my God, these weren't here before? He also was very specific, and this is what makes him a great architect, that level of detail. He looked all over the United States and Europe for the right stone that would look good at the end of the day and get that golden glow. Not all collegiate architecture is the same. I don't want to insult any Princeton people, but they have collegiate Gothic, and it's sort of got a dull gray. It doesn't have that rich golden orange, so to speak, of the quarry that Rogers used for Yale's building. So that was one detail, and one last detail I'll mention, responding to your question. At Davenport College, where I taught, he chose a specific kind of brick that was a very light red, which he considered much more genteel, like Jefferson's Monticello in the University of Virginia, not the darker red, let's say, of Harvard, but a softer yellow, softer red that would seem more genteel and casual for a living a dorm like that, a residence hall. So those were some of the details, but how he chose Gothic to Georgian, I'm not sure exactly. There's an extraordinary story, which I mentioned in this. One of the colleges, again, Davenport, the outside is Gothic, responding to Branford College across the street, which is Gothic. But when you go inside the quad is all Georgian. So it's this wonderful hybrid, a really an architectural joke, if you will, that's very impressive and entertaining and also very profound in a lot of ways. So you can't always get through these colleges without going through gates, but often students let you in. And if you're visiting Yale, look for Davenport, look at the outside, go inside, or you can even peek, and you'll see a different architecture on the inside. Another question? Yes. Oh, you got the mic.
I just wanted to speak as an employee of Robert A.M. Stern and establish for the record that he was not so conceited as to emblazon his own image on the building. That was actually, I think, the contractor's idea, or maybe the stone carver's. He did go along with it.
Well, that I stand corrected. That's good to know. Stern, going back to my style, if you will, he taught me at Columbia many years ago. He was very interested in teaching you watercolor rendering of the architecture that you designed, even in 1983 or whatever this was. And he went back to the model of the Beaux-Arts academies and had us do elaborate washes and careful shade and shadow. I'm sure some of you know these École de Beaux-Arts watercolors are now considered fine arts masterpieces. The Museum of Modern Art did a show about them a number of years ago. So we would do these elaborate renderings, and I loved it. I thought Stern was, the cat's meow teaching me all of this. Some students were horrified because they thought, why am I doing this? This is the 1980s. So I was very fortunate to have him in my life as a teacher, and I grew to do more and more architecture in watercolor, of course, from this book. And I was very touched that later on when I asked him to do the foreword, he said he'd be glad to do it, and I think it's a great contribution to the book. So send him my regards.
Is there any truth to the myth that Paul Rudolph hated painters so much that he pushed them all down and so
It was once the architecture and art building. Now it's just architecture. But at the time, there was the art studios at the bottom. Yes. Yes. Well, that was certainly something the art students hated. I don't know how intentional it was, but it was certainly not a great space for artists, and they eventually built a school of art across the street. But I don't know exactly whether that was true. Did anyone here know Paul Rudolph? Maybe they could see if he was that sinister. Go ahead.
I think your paintings are lovely. They show a generosity of spirit, and to me are happy paintings. I wondered whether there were days when the weather changed or you got an idea in your head that didn't work, that there were some paintings that were never finished at all, that you walked away from.
Yeah. Well, there are days when you set out, you're going to do a painting no matter what, and it's just the weather is not cooperating. And you have to work quickly because you see the clouds are coming. So you figure, I just better do the cupola, or I better just do a few windows and get the hell out of here. But I came all the way to New Haven, let's say, and I was determined to do something. So it's a little different than maybe walking the streets of New York where you can duck into the mechanics library. I made trips before I was a professor to Yale to do these paintings, and so I had to deal with what came my way. Anyone else? You had a question? Yeah.
What do you feel the impact of where you learn, the architecture, the buildings, has on what you learn? How do you learn? Do you learn better in one of these buildings than you would in a public building in Brooklyn?
I'm trying to get the essence of your question. In other words, do I appreciate these buildings differently because
if I'm a student,
yes.
Do I learn differently because of the setting than I do from anything else. Does the setting have an impact on how I learn?
If you're asking the question I think you're asking, I think architecture affects how people learn. And I write about that in my book. I think that's a profound idea. And I think it does, when you're in beautiful spaces, I think you do beautiful things, to be simplistic about it. But you also, the spaces create environments which are conducive to inspiration, to community, to building a sense of identity as a student or a teacher. But you need to be inspired, I think. Theoretically, you can be inspired everywhere, presumably, if you're that drawn to a subject. But it's certainly great to have the help of being in a building like this. It just elevates your desire to learn, your motivation. And it's that fantasy world, right? I mean, it wasn't maybe fantasy for Oxford and Cambridge, because in those days, that's what the architecture was. They were living in the Middle Ages. But for a place like Yale to go back in this sense of continuum of time, which students today can articulate, they feel like they're part of a whole continuum, those who can articulate what the architecture does for them. But I think it makes a big difference. I know it makes a difference to me. If I'm in a very banal building, I feel like I have banal thoughts. Maybe some people are more, attentive to this. I remember one instance when kind of the opposite of this, but I was doing a painting in one of the quads, and I was doing a little corner detail of a tower, small tower, and a student came up and she said, "Wow, that's beautiful. I've lived in Branford College for 3 years, and I've never noticed that tower until now." Now that's flattering in the sense that maybe I helped her see that with my painting. Not everyone necessarily notices, but they do, I think, ultimately, they feel it. And if pressed, I think they could probably talk about it. But it's not something that people are very knowledgeable about. It's kind of a rarefied science, architecture. I find it's kind of an interesting thing that, you can talk to very educated people and you tell them to name 5, maybe 10 architects, and it's astounding. They will name 4. They'll name Frank Lloyd Wright. Everyone will name him. They'll name a few others. They might not even know the name Richard Meyer. They may not know the name Saarinen. But they'll know 30 artists, 40 artists. They'll know 30 composers. They'll know 100 writers. And yet they're surrounded by great architecture all the time. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon. I don't know what the answer is. But so not everyone really studies it the way many of us do or appreciate it. Another question or two, and then we'll have to call it a day.
Last question. I just was wondering, like, how many paintings you made of one building, or did you?
Well, yes. No, sometimes I did a few paintings of the same building, and you're seeing the one that I chose, as I thought was the best. But I sometimes feel I haven't quite got it, and I want to do another one to cover myself, especially since I would then go back to New York and I wouldn't have the opportunity. Some I did on the spot, and I felt I got it right. I always just, maybe some of you are painters, but whenever I do a painting, I then, after I'm done, I then just put it right away in my portfolio or my case or whatever the carrying apparatus is. I don't look at it because, you can be very critical right away and think you see things, but then you go back the next day or the next several hours and you've forgotten the moment of why you were painting or how you're painting, and you just see it as a painting and you have a very different response. It can go either way. Sometimes you think you've done a masterpiece and you go back and you think, what the heck? And the other ones you think, oh God, why did I bother this? And you just close it up and you think, wow. So you come in with preconceived notions sometimes. Again, I'm speaking to, I'm sure, many of you who painted, and you can be pleasantly surprised. But it takes a little time for it to digest. One last question. Okay. I've been told that 7:30 is the cutoff, so.
Wrap this up, but you have a wonderful way to express sunlight, I think, and I wonder, going back to the gentleman's first question about influences, if the American Impressionist Child Hassam who did a lot of work in New England, but very much in the plein air style, if he had an influence on you?
It's funny, I feel like that was a good question, like it was planted, but I know it wasn't. I have a studio, is Child Hassam's old studio on West 57th Street, but he didn't know that. Hassam, yes, he actually is underrated as a watercolorist. He did some exceptional watercolors and deserves to have his place in the canon as a watercolor artist. He's known as a very prolific painter, post-impressionist, but he did mostly oils. Terrific watercolorist. I would say he, to a certain extent, definitely Edward Hopper and John Singer Sargent, who I teach in my class, and certainly J.M.W. Turner, Birchfield, George O'Keeffe. If we're talking about watercolor, these were real masters in that medium. And I teach my students, my course is called Mastering the Art of Watercolor, Classic Techniques from Turner to Hopper. Spend the first hour talking about a given artist, and then I ask them, apropos the style of Stern, learning from traditional methods, I then ask them to try to do something with the study that we just did of Sargent. You can't be Sargent in an hour, but you can do something like he did, which is to do a careful drawing. Sargent did a very careful drawing before he did a watercolor. The German expressionists just went straight for the paint and didn't do a drawing. So little things like that can help you learn from traditional methods without just hitting a blank canvas, if you will, or a blank piece of paper and starting cold, which is the preferred method, I think, today, more than the older methods of working from the previous models. So I think with that, I thank you again. And as a reminder, there are some books there. I'd be glad to inscribe them to you. And if you went to Yale and want the date that you graduated, I can do that. Or if you didn't, I'll be glad to sign it, of course, also. Thank you again.
Before you all get up, Adam, on behalf of the General Society, I would like to thank you so much for... On behalf of the General Society, Adam, I would like to thank you so much for your presentation this evening. I would like to thank you all for coming, and I would like to thank the New York Landmarks Conservancy for their co-sponsorship. Now, Adam, at these events, we normally make a presentation, so I hope you'll just bear with us 1 minute while we do this.
I'll just run to the back.
So, Adam, the presentation is actually to you.
Forgive me. I never leave an opportunity to be honored. I thought you were going to just talk about the General Society.
No, we would like to make a presentation. Adam, we would like to present this citation to you. Adam Van Doren, author and artist, The Stones of Yale. It's been our great pleasure to have you speaking here this evening.
Thank you. Beautiful.
And because we hope you'll come back often and not just to the coffee house, we're going to like to make you a lifetime member of the General Society Library.
Very nice. Thank you so much.
I want to thank you all again for coming here this evening. I want to thank Adam for his eloquent remarks and those gorgeous watercolors. We hope we'll see you again. Adam, thank you so much. And Adam will now sign his books. Thank you.